you ever look in the mirror and wondered, well, why do I look kind of like my family, but not exactly like my family? Well, the answer to this question is a really complicated process called heredity. So we're just going to go over some of the basics today. Heredity is the passing of genetic material from parents to offspring. Let's start by discussing the father of genetics, Gregor Mendel. We call him the father of genetics because he was the first guy who really did some experiments about where traits come from and how traits are passed on. He began this process by studying pea pod plants. Yes, pea pod plants in his monastery garden. He noticed that sometimes the flowers were purple and sometimes the flowers were white, and most of the time the pods themselves were green, but every once in a while they were yellow, and he was fascinated about why this was. Let's do a little quick reminder about flowers, like the pea pod plant. He was able to do his experiments because these are self-pollinating plants, which means that pea pod plants have both the male and the female parts of the flowers. The anther, which is the part up here, has all of the pollen, which is the male sex cell. It is able to pollinate the stigma, and then that pollen grains travel down into the ovary where the eggs are. And when those eggs are fertilized, bam! You have pea pod plants with those tasty peas inside, which we eat. Mendel was a very careful and a very diligent scientist. He made sure he studied only one characteristic of the pea pod plants at a time. A characteristic is a feature that has different forms in a population. These different forms we call traits. For example, let's look at the picture on the right. Example of characteristics of the pea pod plants were the shape, the color of the seed, the color of the pod, and even where the flowers are positioned. These are all characteristics of a pea pod plant. However, these different characteristics are called traits, these different forms of the characteristic. For example, he saw that the seed color could be yellow or the seed could be green. These are traits for seed color. These are traits for seed shape. Let's look at this chart of some of the traits that he studied, some of the characteristics and their traits that Mendel studied. One of them he really concentrated on was the pod color. He noticed that most of the time pea pod plants are green. I mean, think about the ones you eat and get at the grocery store. They're green, right? Well, he found out that the green ones happened more often and gave them the term of being the dominant trait. The pea pod trait that appeared the most often was called dominant. But every once in a while there would still be a yellow pea pod created. We call that trait that seems to fade away or disappear a recessive trait. Well, 150 years ago, Mendel didn't have a whole lot of very sophisticated scientific equipment to carry on his experiments. So what Mendel used to call factors are actually segments of DNA we now know as genes. Genes are segments, are pieces of your DNA, which are wrapped up in your chromosomes, that give instructions for a characteristic. An offspring always inherits two versions of a gene, one version from each parent, one from the male parent, one from the female parent, or as we like to say in our terminologies, mom and dad. Alleles are different versions of the gene. So here you get one allele from each parent for every single gene. So for every single piece of DNA that gives the coding for a particular characteristic. Let's start by looking a little bit more carefully at some of this vocabulary. We've talked about dominant as recessive already. Dominant alleles are shown by that capital letter which you see here circled. We represent recessive alleles by a lowercase letter. The word homozygous means an organism that has two dominant or two recessive alleles. So here we have an example of homozygous, two of the same dominant capital letter. Remember, homo means same. And hetero means different. Heterozygous means an organism with one dominant and one recessive allele. Like you see one capital R and one lowercase r. So that gene, the alleles you've inherited are heterozygous because you've received something different from each parent for that particular characteristic. You have a diagram on your paper to please fill out with some of this vocabulary. Remember, a gene occupies a specific location on both chromosomes for each pair. So this could be maybe the gene to control, let's say, eye color, or the gene to control if you have dimples or not. And here are the two alleles, and you get a different one from each parent, or in this case, a same one from each parent because they're both lowercase t's. Alternate forms of that same gene are called alleles. So here you have two alleles. What does a capital letter mean again? Oh, that's right, it's a dominant trait. So whenever you see a capital letter, it indicates a dominant trait. How about these alleles? They're different. That's right, the word heterozygous means different. How about these alleles? They're both exactly the same. If they're the same, they're homozygous. So make sure you have this diagram filled out. Some more vocabulary. Genotype is the combination of alleles you inherit from your parents. You can't see your genotype necessarily from the outside. It's your genetic code that is on the inside. So think genotype, what's written on your genes. Your genetic code on the inside. The phenotype is what you observe on the outside, those observable traits, what you can see. For example, here's a set of alleles. Here is a gene on those alleles. These say, make green pods. So we're going to pretend this is the instruction to make green pods. What you see on the outside is to actually make green pods, and we see the pods are green. So genotype is what's written on your genes. Phenotype is what we see on the outside. We're going to check out this video clip from the Amoeba sisters to talk a little bit about how many genes can influence a single trait. Some characteristics, like hair color, skin color, eye color, and in this case height, are the result of several genes working together. So let's check it out.
How does that happen? There isn't just one height gene. There's a lot of genes that determine your height. What I mean by that is that you don't just have a pair of alleles, like big A, that will code for your height. It's more like someone having a genotype of big A, big B, little b, big C, little c, and maybe more genes to ultimately determine your height. And you inherit one allele for each of the height genes from each parent. All of these genes work together to determine your height. Your skin color is also determined by many genes, just like your height. These are called polygenic traits. Poly means many, so many genes coding for one trait is what polygenic means. By the way, both height and skin color can be influenced by environmental factors as well. Nutrition, growing up, can affect your height, just as spending a lot of time in the sun can affect your skin color. However, this doesn't change the genetics for this trait.
Thanks, Amoeba sisters. All right, so just to recap, there's a lot of times where it takes several genes working together to make up your traits. It's not always simple as, well, it's just this gene and that gene. Sometimes lots of genes work together. So that's what makes it so complicated. Sometimes even just one gene can influence many traits. Many genetic disorders like sickle cell anemia. Remember, those are the blood cells that are shaped wrong. They're like little sickles or like little hooks or little half moons. And they hook together and make blood clots. Very dangerous. Even white fur, blue-eyed tigers. So those tigers that look really, really cool and really, really pretty, well, it's actually a mutation. And so the mutation that makes them albino and makes their fur white instead of that orangey color is the same gene that controls their eye color and makes them blue. Also, we saw in the little video clip that sometimes environmental factors can have a big play in how an organism looks. For example, the Arctic fox has a gene that tells its fur color to change. It's white in the winter to blend in with the snow and then gets brown in the summer because of that additional sun exposure. It browns the fur and then it can then blend in with the surroundings now that there's no more snow. Now another exception to the rule. The exceptions to complete dominance. Some completely dominated traits, which is when the capital letter completely takes over, are things like freckles and dimples. You either have freckles or you don't. You either have dimples or you don't. So you either have the dominant trait to have them or you have the recessive trait to not. It's pretty easy to follow. But look at all of the other types of traits that you have that aren't necessarily just this or that, where it doesn't follow that rule. Let's go back to Mendel and his pea pod plants and talk about flowers a little bit more. Incomplete dominance is when you can have a mixture of two alleles of the dominant and incomplete dominance. It's where the alleles in a heterozygous organism, remember, heterozygous means the two letters are different, one capital, one lowercase. It's when those alleles blend. Let's give an example. A red flower and a white flower mix together to make a pink flower, just like you see here in this picture. So instead of a capital R and a lowercase r, for example, instead of having red and white mixed together to make pink. This is called incomplete dominance, where you get a middle ground between the two. Another type is called codominance. Codominance is when both of the alleles show, but they're not blended. So this time, the red flower and the white flower combine to make a red and white striped flower. So you see the red, you see the white, it's not mixed, but instead it's striped. So this is called codominance. I mean, look around at all the different traits that people have. If this is how complicated even a flower can be, look at how complicated all of our human traits can be. One more thing I just want to go over with you are about Punnett squares. Punnett squares are used to make predictions about offspring. Remember, you inherit a set of alleles from mom and alleles from dad, but which alleles will you actually get? So let's go back again to Mendel and his pea pod plants. He discovered that pea pod plants could either be yellow or they could be green. A Punnett square does not tell you what the exact results of a cross will be, it can just tell you the probability that you will receive certain genetic traits from the parents. It's the probability, the mathematical chance. So let's look at this Punnett square right here, which you already have in your notes. So we have the recessive green color, we have the dominant yellow color. We take the alleles from each parent and bring them down into the squares and across into the squares. So we can see all the different possibilities of how those letters could combine. In this case, for the parents, the genes from the parents we see here, there's a 50% chance that we'll get a yellow pea pod plant and a 50% chance we'll get a green pea pod plant. We have 2 out of 4 that are yellow. We have 2 out of 4 that are green. So we're looking at all the possibilities of how the parent's genetics will cross, because you get one allele from each parent. Everybody has 2 alleles for every trait. You get 1 from each parent. So we're just looking at all the possible ways they could combine. Well, that's all I have for you this time, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time.